The politics and economics of the Roaring Twenties. This is the first video of our Roaring Twenties unit. In it, we will discuss demobilization, domestic and economic policy under the three Republican presidents of the 1920s, U.S. foreign policy, and international peacekeeping attempts. Demobilization. Demobilization is the process of adjusting to peace. As World War I ended in November 1918, soldiers returned from Europe to continue with their civilian lives, and production went back to normal, switching once more from military to consumer goods. The process of demobilization affected the economy, and the U.S. experienced a depression that lasted from 1920 to 1921. Factories had temporarily closed to adapt to a peacetime economy, and soldiers stopped receiving their paychecks from the military. Women and African Americans who had taken jobs in factories were laid off, and farmers were also affected as demand of food went down after the war. To make matters worse, the 1918 influenza pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu, struck the United States, killing more people than the war itself. The three Republican presidents of the 1920s. From 1921 to 1933, Republican presidents occupied the White House, following conservative policies favorable to American business. President Warren Harding was elected as president in 1921, with his program to return to normalcy, which implicated a return to isolationism after the war. Harding intended to focus more on prosperity at home, and a lot less on foreign policy. During his administration, Congress passed the Fordney-McCumber Act, setting higher tariffs, intending to keep foreign products out, and thus favoring American farmers and producers. These tariffs affected Canada and our trading partners in Europe. These countries promptly retaliated by passing higher tariffs of their own. As a result, world trade decreased tremendously. Harding's economic policy also lowered corporate and income taxes and embraced a laissez-faire approach, relaxing or abandoning many of the regulations of the progressive era. The Harding administration was marked by corruption. A clear example is the Teapot Dome scandal, which was widely published in the press. The Secretary of Interior was denounced for accepting personal bribes from businessmen in exchange for leasing oil-rich federal lands in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to oil companies at prices below market value. Warren Harding died in office in 1923 from a heart attack, right before all this information became public. Vice President Calvin Coolidge became president upon Harding's death. Coolidge continued many of Harding's policies under his motto, "The business of America is business." Calvin Coolidge received the nickname Silent Cal because he seldom spoke in public. Despite this, Coolidge successfully ran for re-election on the slogan, "Coolidge Prosperity." His presidency was marked by reductions in government expending, high tariffs, regression taxation, and little or no regulation, especially on the frenzy and speculation taking place in the financial and real estate markets. Coolidge decided not to run for re-election in 1928 without any explanation. In 1929, Herbert Hoover became president after announcing his campaign that America was on the verge of ending poverty. Hoover believed that the improvements in the standards of living were due to the American system, which he defined as a society where everyone was given an education and equal opportunity to succeed. Thus, for Hoover, the key to America's economy success was its rugged individualism, a term which encompasses the love for personal freedom, self-reliance, resourcefulness, and the willingness to work hard, compete, and succeed. The world economy entered an abrupt depression soon after Hoover became president. The economic boom of the 1920s. In 1914, Henry Ford introduced electric conveyor belts on his assembly lines, greatly increasing efficiency in production. This innovation brought down car prices, and more Americans were able to afford automobiles. Automobiles, of course, would change American life forever as more people moved out of the city centers and into the suburbs, stimulating a real estate boom and creating jobs in many other industries, from steel to construction to gas stations. Other industries gained importance in the US economy. The use of electricity expanded greatly, and with it, new household appliances like vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, and toasters became available. The manufacturing and purchase of radios was also stimulated by the first commercial radio broadcasts. Similarly, the new motion pictures were produced in the United States, soon becoming an important industry and a national pastime for more than half of the population. Mass production required mass consumption, and the United States embarked on an age of consumerism on a scale never seen before. Advertisement became widespread, accomplishing its role to stimulate demand. Mail-in order catalogs were important in small towns and rural areas, while giant department stores in cities informed customers on new products and the latest trends. A lot of retailers extended credit to customers and allowed them to buy cars, refrigerators, and appliances through installment buying. The economy grew rapidly, and there was an overall feeling of prosperity. The prosperity, however, did not reach everyone. Many farmers faced bankruptcy after a sharp drop in prices due to agricultural overproduction. Other industries affected included railroads, which in many cases were replaced by cars and trucks, coal, which was replaced by oil and gas, and textiles, which faced increased competition from Europe. Minorities did not benefit either. African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans had limited education and job opportunities, low pay, and high levels of unemployment. Speculation. Speculation is the act of buying an item, not for personal use, but rather with the hope of reselling it later at a higher price in order to make a profit. Speculation in the stock market and in real estate in the 1920s was fueled by an atmosphere of easy money. As many Americans started extensively investing in the stock market, stock prices rose steadily to the point that they no longer had any relation to the company's ownership percentage, assets, or profits. As long as investors were able to sell their stocks at higher prices, there were plentiful profits to be made. Lots of Americans entered the stock market with the dream of becoming rich really fast. They started buying stocks on margin, which means that instead of paying the full price, they would make a down payment of 10% and pay the rest later with future stock profits. The risk was huge. Not being able to sell the stock meant losing the 10% investment and not being able to pay the remaining 90% to the bank. Similarly, prices in real estate began to increase, creating a bubble in that market, especially in the state of Florida. Speculation was not sustainable, and many families would lose everything. U.S. foreign policy in the 1920s. The 1920s were an era of isolationism for the United States. The recent war and the failure to join the League of Nations were determinant in forming foreign policy. The United States had to deal with two main issues: the collection of war debts from the Allies, and making diplomatic efforts to ensure international peace and stability. The Dawes Plan. As the war ended, the Allies were expected to pay back the generous loans that they had received from the United States. The Allies, however, insisted on having the debt canceled since they had been fighting the war since the beginning. Wilson and the Republican presidents who followed refused to do so. The adoption of higher tariffs and the subsequent reduction in trade meant that Britain and France were not selling much to the United States, and thus a transfer of payments was unfeasible. The Allies then depended on Germany's reparation payments to honor their war debts to the United States. By the early 1920s, Germany's economy had not fully recovered from the war, and Germany was unable to make reparation payments to the Allies. In a desperate attempt to make payments, the German government printed excessive amounts of money, which resulted in further damage to the economy, bringing record high inflation and making the German currency lose all of its value. In 1924, American banker Charles Dawes came up with a brilliant plan to fix this problem. As part of the plan, Germany's reparation payments were temporarily reduced, and U.S. private investors lent $200 million to cover German reparation payments to Britain and France. The Allies received the reparation payments, which were used to make war debt payments to the United States. In essence, the money that was lent to Germany made its way back into the U.S. Treasury, even as Germany still had to pay back American private investors for the loan. The German economy recovered, and inflation was corrected with a new currency. As a result, Europe returned to a path of economic growth and prosperity. The Washington Naval Conference. In 1921, Harding invited Britain, Japan, Italy, France, and other naval powers to a conference in Washington, D.C., aiming to promote world peace. The Washington Naval Conference became the world's first proposal for partial disarmament. The three leading naval powers, Britain, the U.S., and Japan, agreed to reduce the number of battleships by keeping a 5-5-3 ratio. This meant that the United States would have the same number of battleships as Great Britain, while Japan accepted to have slightly fewer, with 3 Japanese battleships for every 5 American or British battleships. Other powers also agreed to reduce their number of battleships. The agreement, however, had a major gap. It only covered large battleships and had no restrictions on the number of submarines, cruisers, or small warships, promoting a new arms race. The 4 and the 9 Power Treaties. As part of this conference, 2 other treaties were reached. In the 4 Power Treaty, the United States, Britain, Japan, and France agreed to respect each other's territorial claims and rights in the Pacific region, and to settle disputes in a joint conference of all 4 powers. All delegates to the conference also signed the 9 Power Treaty, agreeing to respect China's sovereignty and independence. In this way, the U.S. wanted to achieve international recognition for its open-door policy, something that in practice was impossible. The Geneva Disarmament Conference. Hoping to address the gaps in the Washington Naval Conference agreements and repeat Harding's success, Coolidge called for a disarmament conference in Geneva, Switzerland. Attending countries, however, were not willing to accept further limitations on their militarism, and the meeting was unsuccessful. The Kellogg-Briand Pact. In a letter to U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg, French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand announced that France was ready to enter a treaty with the United States outlawing the use of war. Kellogg immediately accepted, but insisted that the treaty be expanded to include other nations. In 1928, 15 nations signed the Paris Pact, commonly known as the KleffoggBriand Pact, renouncing war as a mechanism to deal with international conflicts. The pact was approved by Congress, and even Kellogg received the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. The pact had its gaps as well. It permitted nations to engage in defensive war and proved ultimately ineffective. The decade of the 1930s would close with the start of the most destructive war in human history, World War II. In the next video, we will take a look at the Red Scare, a new rise in nativism, and generational conflicts over traditional and new values.